In this presentation, we will analyze what effect a stroke has on the central nervous system. Now, to understand what this effect is, we must first define a stroke. And a stroke is defined as damage to the brain due to an interruption of its blood supply. Now, this is important because the brain requires a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients to function. If the supply is cut off for any reason, brain cells will almost immediately begin to die. Now, before we can determine what effect a stroke has on the central nervous system, we must first review its anatomy and physiology. Now, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, the brain being located in the skull and the spinal cord being located in the vertebral column in our spine. Now, the brain itself is broken down into three main parts. The first being the cerebrum, which contains its right and left hemispheres, its cerebellum, which is located inferior to the cerebrum, and the brainstem, which connects it to the spinal cord, which then connects to the peripheral nervous system via the peripheral nerves. Now, there are two types of matter present in the central nervous system. The first is white matter, which contains myelinated axons, which is located primarily deep within the brain or on the periphery of the spinal cord. The second is gray matter, which contains neuron cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. This is located primarily on the periphery of the cerebrum or deep within the spinal cord. Now, there is a structure in your central nervous system called meninges. Meninges are membranes located between its bone and its soft tissues which protect it. Additionally, protecting the brain is the blood-brain barrier, which is a network of blood vessels and tissues which control what substances reach the brain. Since it is semi-permeable, substances such as pathogens or lipids will not be able to enter the blood-brain barrier, but substances such as oxygen or carbon dioxide that the brain needs to function will be able to enter its environment. Now, there is also a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which will flow in and around the hollow spaces of the brain and spinal cord. It will serve as a shock absorber, and it will also serve to remove waste products from brain and neural cells. Now, moving on to the functions of the central nervous system, starting with the brain. In the brain's cerebral cortex, which is located in its cerebrum, it has four lobes. The frontal lobe controls our higher intellectual processes. These are actions such as planning or critical thinking, and it also controls voluntary skeletal muscle movements. The parietal lobes deal with our sensory information, which is our ability to touch, to feel pain or shocks or temperature. It also deals with our ability to understand and use speech for communication. Now, the temporal lobes deal with hearing and memory, and they will often combine a series of complex sensory information to remember sensory experiences, such as watching a movie. Now, the occipital lobes deal with our vision, and they often combine our vision with other sensory experiences to create the picture of how we view the world. Now, the brainstem controls the life support functions of the body. Now, these are things such as our ability to control our breathing, our heartbeat, and our blood pressure. And it also will communicate with the spinal cord itself. Now, in the cerebellum, it deals with our muscle actions and control. And these are things beyond voluntary skeletal muscle movements, such as fine motor skills, our balance, and our coordination, essentially our kinesthetic sense. Now, in the spinal cord, it has really two main functions. The first is the spinal reflexes, which maintain homeostatic functions and control automatic actions such as coughing or sneezing. Now, we'll also conduct sensory and motor impulses to and from the brain as well from the peripheral nervous system. Now that we have gone over the anatomy and physiology of the central nervous system, we can use that to analyze what effects strokes have on it. And to begin that process, we must first understand that there are two main types of strokes. The first is an ischemic stroke, which is the most common type, and it's caused by a blockage to a major blood vessel in the brain, and this is most likely from a blood clot or a platelet formation. Now, the second type is a hemorrhagic stroke, and it occurs when a blood vessel in the brain bursts, which will cause rampant bleeding in and around the brain, which will produce swelling and pressure, which will kill neural cells within it. Now, we must analyze the effects that these two types of strokes have on the brain, and they are relatively the same. Now, but to understand how serious these effects are, you must first know that the brain will consume 20% of the body's oxygen and glucose supply. Now, this is because neurons are the most metabolically active cells in the body, and the brain has an average of 85 million of them. And now these brain cells will primarily use the oxygen from blood to oxidize carbohydrates, its favorite carbohydrate being glucose, which it uses for energy. And if this supply is cut off for any reason, these brain cells will almost immediately begin to die, and you can lose roughly 1.9 million neurons a minute during a stroke. Now, some early warning signs that a stroke is occurring will vary depending on which part of the brain is being affected. Now, these can include numbness in the face, arm, or leg, often on one side of the body, confusion or trouble speaking, impaired vision, or a dizziness or a loss of balance. Now, depending on which part of the brain has been affected, there can be multiple varying symptoms. So say if the cerebrum of the brain has been affected by a stroke, possible impairments could include movement, speech, eating, vision, or cognitive ability, depending if one or more of the four brain's lobes has experienced a stroke. Now, if the stroke has affected the cerebellum of the brain, possible impairments will really attack our muscle control. That will mean things such as fine motor skills, balance, and coordination might be impaired or lost entirely. And lastly, if a stroke has affected the brainstem, that means our life support functions are at risk of failing. These are things like our ability to breathe, our heart function, and our temperature control due to factors such as blood pressure. Now, if a stroke has occurred in the brainstem, this is considered the most serious kind of stroke because it can lead to a coma or possibly death. Now, after the stroke has occurred and we have identified which type of stroke it is, it can be treated in one of two different ways. The first way for ischemic strokes, the most common treatment is a use of medications. Now, these medications are broken down into four main categories. The first is a clot buster medication, which works by thrombolysis. Now, thrombolysis is the destruction of blood clots to allow a bigger supply of blood back to the brain to prevent the stroke from continuing. And these medications are best taken about 4 to 4.5 hours after a stroke. The second is the use of antiplatelets, which are usually taken straight after a stroke and will prevent the formation of a platelet buildup in the blood. Next would be an anticoagulant, which prevent blood clots by actually changing the chemical composition of blood to prevent it from clotting, which often makes it much thinner. Lastly, statins are used to prevent cholesterol buildup by blocking the enzyme in the liver that actually produces the substance. Now, as a hemorrhagic stroke is much more serious, some medication could be provided to prevent blood clots, but in most cases, they will require surgery to be performed. Now, the surgery is called a craniotomy, and in this surgery, a section of the skull will be removed so the surgeon can then stop bleeding and repair damaged blood vessels. Once this process has been completed, the surgeon will then replace that portion of the skull with a metal plate. And in conclusion, what we can take from this presentation is that strokes are a very serious affliction that affects the central nervous system. And if not treated properly, effectively, or quickly, can lead to a permanent loss of motor function, control, or other body systems, which then could eventually result in a coma or death. Thank you.